Hello and welcome to the Booktopia podcast. I'm Olivia Fricot, senior content producer and editor of the Booktopian blog, and I'm joined today by Sarah McDuling, our kids and YA category manager, and Shanu Prasad, our lifestyle books category manager. And today we're basically going to be talking about Midnight Sun, which is the new book from Stephanie Meyer that retells the first Twilight book from the vampire Edward Cullen's perspective. It landed a couple of weeks back, and we've all had time to read some of this hefty tome and form some opinions. And today we're going to be chatting all things Midnight Sun and Twilight in general. Exciting, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so Twilight's kind of one of those cultural phenomena that carries a bit of baggage. So I think let's begin by talking about our Twilight experiences. What were our formative Twilight experiences? How did we come to read it? Were you part of the original craze or did you come to it later? Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so Twilight I read when it was the only one published. And I actually thought, well, okay, I might be wrong about that. It's possible that one or two of the other books were already out, but I assumed it was a standalone book when I was reading it. It was definitely before the movies or anything like that. And I thought that it was this adorable standalone little book with this ending that was like, will they or won't they? Who knows? We'll never tell you, right? Like the end. And then I remember being like quite shocked when I realized it was part of a series and thinking, oh, well, you know, that was such an adorable romance. Like, I wonder what happens next. And then I read what happens next. And and the series kind of lost me. Like, I kind of lost, I liked the first book and then I kind of didn't really love the rest of the series. And that was my Twilight journey. And then the movies came out and they were fun.
That was a whole other journey.
Yeah.
I just remember we were sitting down for dinner one night. I think I was in year 10, year 9 or year 10. So like kind of hitting that peak of like YA, like the ideal reading age for YA, I guess. And I just remember my older sister going on and on about this book, and I'd kind of like half tuned it out, and then I started listening, and she's like, and it's about a vampire, and he falls in love with this girl, her name's Bella, and it's just so beautiful, and I'm obsessed with it. And I was just like, oh yeah, what's that? And she lent me the first book, and like, this is the quickest I've ever gone through the obsession, love, hate cycle with something. I think that was the first thing that triggered this pattern of media consumption in Baby Live. I loved the first 3 books. I was obsessed. I got all my friends at school reading them. And I just remember reading the last book and finishing it and going, well, what the hell was that? That was terrible. Terrible is a strong word, but I remember being very, very disillusioned with it and like threw the book away and was like, well, I'm never reading those again. And I just remember going to school the next day and everyone's like, so what did you think? And I was like, I did not like it. And
you turned on a dime.
Yeah, I did. It was so strange. And I don't know. And then
Shanu, what about you?
Well, I was in New York and I used to go to the Strand bookstore all the time because they had because I love YA, and when I was in New York, I was not a young adult. I was an adult in my early 20s. So I'd go to the Strand bookstore kind of every week, and I would buy like a whole bunch of books that they would have these young adult books that were like $5. And I found this book, just one of maybe 40 books I read while I was there, and I picked it up and I read it. I was like, that's a good story. Quite like that. Was a huge fan of, had always been a massive fan of Buffy. So Buffy and Angel to me are like, that is the human vampire love story that all love stories have to be. So a lot of people that they may not have had that experience because Buffy was a little bit earlier. We didn't have streaming services back then. So that was, I didn't really think too much of it because it was because I was in America, and it was like a phenomenon that didn't really start straight away. And so I just picked it up and read it as if it was any other kind of book. And then when I got home to Australia, and then I think the second book must have been coming out or something, and then all of a sudden it was like this huge thing, and I'm like, oh, I read that book. I was like, oh, I'm part of something. It was very exciting. And then I read all the rest of them, and they were fine. I was fine with them. I didn't have any things. And then the movie came out, and I was like, this movie is the worst casting I've ever seen of anything in my life. Watch it because they're all wearing really bad makeup. And I remember when I watched the movie thinking, oh, this is very, oh yeah, well, makeup does not get better. I remember thinking, oh, well, maybe, you know, I was like, oh no, the book was way better than the movie, like the first Twilight book. And then after that, I have never reread them. So I read them when they came out originally, exactly as they came out. And then what I remember most about Twilight is, unfortunately, I'd say from the movies more than anything else. So I can't even remember what my reaction was to the end of Twilight saga. Like I can't even remember that. But I have a feeling that I probably went, oh, that's an interesting way of making all the characters happy. That's what I thought.
Interesting.
Now I think Shanu, like, that's a very strange way.
I'm with you 100% on Buffy. I think that the main reason I would have picked up that book is because of having loved Buffy and thinking,
yes,
you know, vampire human love story would have immediately triggered Buffy and Angel for me, and I probably picked up that book hoping to find something like that. And then, you know, I say I didn't like the rest of the books. I did read them though, so like it's not as though the series really lost me. I read all of those books, but I think that certainly by the last one I had reached probably like levels of just not really understanding some of the choices on how the book ended. However, reading Midnight Sun has really reminded me of how enchanting Twilight is, and it made me sort of think of that first book and the experience of reading that first book separate from the movies, which came later, and you know how absorbing it was. Like there's a reason I went through 3 more books in that series, even, you know, not loving all of the plot points, and I think that the reason is because I enjoyed that first book so much. Right? Like there's something about it.
There is, and like my initial distaste for the series has kind of lessened off over the years into like just kind of like from apathy to kind of just fond remembrance of like how much I loved that first book. So I'm very much with you on that. And like I guess this is a good jumping off point to talk about what we thought of Midnight Sun, because this is about twice the length of the original Twilight book, and I
think it's 200 more pages. Yeah.
Oh, okay. 200 more pages, and
200
it's been
more
like 12
pages.
years. Yeah, it's like 1200 12 years in the making or something. And it's a book that Stephanie Meyer was originally going to release until the first few chapters got leaked or something, and she gave up on it. And now it's here, and we've read. Yeah,
and it's selling like crazy, like
the proverbial hot takes.
Yeah, like I find it so interesting that she wrote the 4 books, and you know, love them or hate them, and I certainly love them more than I hate them. They are like a phenomenon, right? Like they're a worldwide phenomenon. People went mad for it, and they were crazy for it. And then since Breaking Dawn was published, there's been 2 more publications connected to this series. The first being the little novella, the short second life of Britannia, which is just telling this like really sad little story of a side character who gets killed in book 3, I believe, and then the second one was on the 10-year anniversary. Stephanie Meyer, I remember there being speculation that she was going to release Midnight Sun then, but instead of Midnight Sun, we got Life or Death, which was a gender-flipped retelling of Twilight, which I actually haven't read. Have you guys read that?
I didn't even know it
existed. And until you talked about it the other week, I was like, what are you I was like, oh, Sarah's just making stuff up now. I don't know what she's talking about. So
no, it's a real thing. And I didn't.
I Googled it.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow.
And I didn't at the time.
Yeah,
I wasn't. At the time that came out, I was like, I just didn't read it at the time. But now I feel like I might want to read it now. Like I feel like this.
So you
Twilight
enjoyed
Renaissance.
what you read of So you enjoyed what you read of Midnight Sun?
Yes. So it's a 700-page book, and I know Shanu was able to like read it very quickly. but I am reading it luxuriously slowly. So
I think that does colour my thoughts on the book as well, remember, because I was like, okay, we've got to get some content out, so we need to read it. I was like, I'll read it, not having any idea of how long it was when I volunteered myself to read it in one night, which I did, basically. And so I was just like stressed because I had to read it really fast. And I was like, okay, we're up to page 277. And even the thing, because the one thing that we know is about to happen hasn't even happened yet. And that stressed me out a lot. Whereas I think if you're reading it as a normal person, as just reading a book, it's probably a lot better, because then you can get like the nuances of what the differences are between the book. And that's the other thing, is I was trying to work out what I could tell people about the new book. And then I realized as I was reading the book that I couldn't remember anything that had happened in the actual book, and all my memories were of the movie. So I was just like, oh, did I know this already? Or is this new information? And thankfully, there are lots and lots of people who are huge fans, and also fast readers who read the book and then put very helpful things on the internet to tell me what bits were part of the original and what bits weren't. So I think it was a very very interesting reading experience. But
has it made you want to reread
I definitely wish that
Twilight?
I'd read so fast.
It kind of has made me want to reread it.
Yeah, me too. Because okay, so I'm like not even halfway yet through this book, and I'm just reading it like. It's not a book that I would really want to binge, because we're in Edward's head, and he has very kind of like intense, detailed thought processes. And and it's amazing. Like, I'm enjoying it, but I couldn't do a long reading stint of it. I like having like little breaks between all of this. But one thing I'm enjoying about it is that he does seem to on occasion have a bit of a sense of humor about how his own personality, like, you know, he refers a few times to his tendency to brood, and like I don't know, I kind of like that. And I like how I've seen a lot of stuff online about how people are taking like a passage from Twilight and then taking the same part of the story from Midnight Sun and putting them side by side, and how funny it is to like compare their thought processes, because like Edward's version will be 3 paragraphs long, and in that 3 paragraphs he'll be like wondering about like what could Bella be thinking, and like go through all of these hypotheticals, and then in Bella's perspective it's like a 2-sentence thing where she's not thinking anything, she's just like totally dazzled by his smile or something. It's just really it's funny.
Yeah, it has fun with it, and like I find it very readable. Like, you blink and you've read 50 pages, which and I could be approaching any book. Like, it could be by my favorite author ever, and if I see it's 800 pages, I'm like, oh boy, okay. And I find it a bit intimidating, even when it's someone I love. But I would blink and I'd read 50 pages, and blink and you'd read another 50, and you're like, this is really readable. And I do like that Edward has that bit of sense of humor, but I'm also really liking getting that insight into the Cullens a bit more. Before Bella came and upended everything.
I think that's really the only, honestly, the like difference between the two books, that in terms of actual events that happen, not Edward's thought processes. Obviously, the two things about the book is Edward's thought processes is what you find out about, and then also it's really the only actual things that happen in the book that aren't in the original book are when he's with his family. So you definitely get like a whole, like, you could totally imagine a whole spin-off.
I want those spin-offs.
Family, you know, and like
she released sorry
before that, and everything that happened to them after that, you know. No, that's it.
Yeah, sorry. This is podcasting when we're not in the room together. I find it so difficult not to talk over people. I'm sorry. However, Stephenie Meyer has apparently announced, and I don't know if this is true or not, because, you know,
I think it is.
Yes, it was.
It is? Okay, so 2 more books. I definitely want one of those to be Alice and Jasper's story. Like, I want to know about those guys, when they met, how they made it to the Cullens, all of that stuff. Because that to me is a very interesting story.
Yeah.
What would you guys want?
I would want that, because she reveals in this that she knew she was going to meet Jasper and fall in love with him. And I think Alice was my favourite Cullen family
She's the
member.
best Cohen. There's no
Yeah.
question.
So I kind of I want that story explored of like she knows who her love is going to be, like for certain, and like that they're going to love. And then how would you act when you were meeting them for the first time? Like,
I want to know. I feel like that would be such a good story. I would eat that up.
Yeah.
Would you guys ever want to read a story about Renesmee?
Oh.
Not if she ends up with Jacob.
Yeah,
like strange.
And she definitely would, right? I don't see Stephanie Meyer pairing her up with anyone else.
Yeah.
But you couldn't, could you? I mean, it would have been fine if Jacob was her protector or her something or her like guide to life or something like that. But making them, But again, I guess what are you going to do when you if you don't have an issue with, a 100-year-old and a 16-year-old, then you're probably not going to have an issue with a 3-year-old and a 16-year-old, right?
I know. Look, one of my big reasons for not loving the other books in the series was that I don't like love triangles generally. So the whole Will Team Jacob, Team Edward thing, I was always like, it's obviously going to be Team Edward, so this is just a moot point. And then, and I just I find it hard to read through books when it's so obvious the way things are going to go. Also, another point I meant to say earlier, between Twilight and Midnight Sun, I think one of the reasons Midnight Sun is more interesting is that when you're in Edward's perspective, you don't have to slog through that whole part of Twilight where she's trying to figure out what he is. And that's kind of not the best part of that book. I just remember it's clear from the blurb, you pick up this book knowing it's a vampire, and having to go through half of that book with Bella trying to figure out what his thing is not the best. That's out of the picture in Midnight Sun. From the get-go. Well, she still has to figure it out, but we're not in her head.
So we can focus on other things.
No, but we're in Edward's head. So we're focusing
on other things.
So he's worried that she's going to find out.
Yeah, his struggle of do I tell her? Will she figure it out? And also that curiosity. And is she figuring this out? This is interesting.
And how will she react? I find that much more interesting than is he? Why did he move so fast? I don't understand. I find his point of view generally more interesting than Bella's point of view.
Yeah, I can see that.
I don't think I do, honestly. I just maybe it's because I just struggled with the way that she'd written that she'd written certain things about Edward that didn't really I got that he was broody and really broody and really 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 broody and tortured
and so old fashioned and so what's the word? I guess chivalrous.
But then he's doing things. But under the guise of it being old fashioned, that's why it's okay. And I don't know. I think a lot of people have said that section. I don't know. Some people still might be okay with it, but I haven't found those people.
Oh, are we talking about the watching Bella sleep angle?
I mean, protecting. Yes, I mean protecting. Because I get that it's getting framed as he's really worried about her mortality because he realizes that she could die from anything, anytime, and he gets really freaked out. And there's a really good conversation and I can imagine it actually being. I think that would, if I'd been reading it slower, would have been quite a funny part where the rest of his family are like, dude, just get over it, and he's like, no, but oh my god, she could anything, she could be bitten by a spider, she could do this, and you can kind of get it from that perspective. It still doesn't. It's still a bit of a. I don't know. It still didn't read very well for me.
Me,
very well in the first book, and it didn't read it better for me in the second one.
I found it way worse in the first book because in Twilight, when he reveals to her that he's been watching her sleep, she doesn't really react. She's like, oh, that's not good, but she's not as horrified as I feel like you probably should be. Whereas when we're in his head, he's genuinely ashamed of himself, and it's written on the page that it's not good behavior, whereas it's never on the page in Twilight. In Twilight, it's sort of, if you're just going by the characters' reactions and what's written in it, it's just romantic. And in this book, I feel like an effort was made for him to really address the fact that his behavior is problematic and then sort of frame it in a way that, to me, it just made it a bit less creepy. It just made it more about, like you were saying, Shanu, it made it more about the fact that he is this bizarre, like, immortal creature who's never had to worry about. Yeah, and suddenly his heart is, and the whole purpose for his life is in this, like, fragile thing that could die at any moment. So it did make it a bit less creepy for me.
And I also think teenage girls are very, like, the way, unfortunately, a lot of us are conditioned is we don't question a lot of behaviour that we really should be questioning because it's presented to us as romantic. So, like, honestly, like, reading it as a young, prepubescent teenager, I was just like, oh yeah, someone would love me so much. That's fine. Like, and then you're reading it down, you're like, I have some questions.
Yeah, this is not okay. It's really not okay.
Attractive when they sleep. That's really the biggest thing. Is that?
Apart from anything else.
I was like,
I'm a drooler. Okay,
it's not attractive to watch someone sleep generally.
Leaving aside the breaking and entering and the invasion of privacy.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell he was really, really, really in love if he still thought she was as beautiful as ever. Like after watching her sleep and have like.
That's a pretty good litmus test, I think.
Pretty impressive. What the other thing that I thought, and I just can't. This is the bit that I cannot remember if this was the same in the first book or not. But there's a whole section where they have these conversations about what they like, and Bella talks about her favorite books and her favorite music, and like what she wants to do when she leaves school. Is it just me, or does any of that happen in the first book? I don't remember that at all happening, where you find things out about Bella.
I had the same thought
and stuff.
When I was reading it. I was like, I remember that they talked, but I don't remember this much detail.
No, and I'm like, that is interesting, because that's one of the other things, obviously, in that first book, is that the book is not really, it feels like an allegory kind of thing, as opposed to they're not like, the way that she reacts is a very unusual way that you would not expect like you don't see very often in books, that the person just is like, oh yeah. And then the whole rest of the book is like, there is nothing to say, like there's no struggle. She just accepts and moves on. So I thought that was very interesting in the latest book, that, really fleshes her out as a person with like her own interests and things, as opposed to just this one,
So I do want to reread Twilight, because I'm sure
kind of her love for Edward.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's some version of that.
I would have remembered if they talked about Limp Bizkit. I'm pretty sure I would have remembered even back then, if they talked about Limp Bizkit as a band that they were listening to anytime. Like, that's a very specific and even at the time,
is
I don't
specific,
think that
isn't
really,
it?
It was a weird time capsule into 2005, where you're like, oh man, yeah, I was in year 7.
But to me, Limp Bizkit felt much more like earlier than that, so I was like, okay, so that was very very interesting to me.
I truly don't know. I will report back to you. I'll read the first book again, and I'll let you know whether or not Limp Bizkit is mentioned.
So I guess what we can like,
if I just control find. Sorry, Liv.
Yeah. No, that's all right. Just like, I think if anything is clear from like what we've talked about already, is that Twilight is not something that you can just be like meh about. For most people, in like when it comes to being a public phenomenon, it's both adored and reviled. Do we think that's fair? Is it warranted? Why has there been such a strong public reaction to what is essentially what is essentially a young adult romance, like paranormal romance? Like, it just became such a phenomenon, and I remember being surprised, like,
it cops shit because it's romance, and romance always cops shit. It's really it gets more shit heaped on it than any other genre. There's like a real bias against romance. I feel like a lot of people write it off as being like silly or inconsequential. And
combined with the fact that it's for young girls as well, and anything that teenage girls adore tends to get publicly ridiculed. So like, look at One Direction. If you are being a One Direction fan was something of shame if you weren't a teenage girl. And which is like, so
if
strange.
you ever find yourself criticizing Twilight, take a step back and ask yourself, well, why don't I criticize like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Transformers or like
because
not
like I don't
anything
think
that
Twilight is any better or worse in terms of how it's written than a lot of other stuff out there that's for young people. Like, it's not winning any Booker prizes. It's definitely, you're not reading it for the beautiful prose. At least I'm not. You're reading it for the story.
Stephanie Meyer's a good storyteller.
Some people really enjoy the way she uses a lot of descriptive language. I find that hard I find that harder. I find it like it sticks. It doesn't make. I know that Sarah found it very, really, and I think you guys find it super easy to kind of like get into and just read the kind of and just start reading. Whereas I found myself just concentrating too much on the actual phrases that were being used rather than the story that was being told. But
it is
I
purple
don't.
prose. And it gets a lot of criticism for being purple prose, but I find it flowery and in keeping with
young adult fiction in general.
Yeah, well, more to the point, because young adult's such a broad thing. Yeah. This is a romance. First and foremost, it's a romance. It's a story of forbidden love, and this like flowery speech fits. It's in keeping with that story. So yeah, it's definitely her style. She's not like one for being succinct. She like really dwells in moments. She like revels in these like every minute emotion and thought process. You're really like sunk deep into the emotions of this book. So it's definitely not a plot driven book. It's 100% character driven. It's all about the emotions, and you really need to want to wade in and like revel in the romance of it. Otherwise this book is definitely not for you. Like, if you don't want to go through every little minute thought process someone has as they're falling in love for the first time, then pick another series, right?
And I think it's smart that she did focus on that. She knew that like we already know the plot. We know basically what happens. Like, even if we forget details, we know that we know where it's going. And you're on this journey because you care about the character of Edward. So I guess like just jumping off on this idea of Twilight as both young adult fiction and romance, like what did Twilight do for young adult fiction, and what do we think Midnight Sun will do for it? Like, however many years later, it's like 15 years later now, isn't it? 2005.
Yeah.
Is it more about nostalgia than anything else? Like,
but is the 15-year cycle enough for nostalgia to go into Renaissance? Like, are we going to now have a whole nother wave of wildly romantic YA books? Because that's what it did last time. Last time Twilight came, and then there are a million Twilight ripoffs, and
so many.
Everyone was trying to write. Yeah, so many vampire books, so many tales of like.
That it wasn't because he was a vampire that was not actually the point of the book, or probably why that wasn't the thing. Like, the vampire was one bit of it, but it's the forbiddenness and the can't be togetherness and the struggleness and all of that kind of stuff was more important than vampires, which is why a lot of those vampire ones just fell flat that came after it, because they missed what she was actually, what was the appeal. It wasn't just because he was a vampire.
I mean, I think the whole vampire thing, like, I agree and I don't agree, Shanu, I guess. I think the vampire thing is very central to Twilight's original appeal. And the fact that people couldn't successfully replicate it, I think, is a different matter. But, like, Stephanie Meyer is very good at exploiting the vampire mythology, especially, like, the more sexual and sensual side of it, because it became a good conduit for, like, expressing teenage sexual desire and sensuality, which we like to pretend doesn't exist, but it's there. And she found a way to tap into it while also being very, like, I don't want to say conservative, but like chaste. It was just
very chaste.
I don't know. Yeah. I think the vampirism is central to Twilight's appeal, but no one else has been able to quite.
Yes. Sorry, I probably didn't phrase what I was trying to say very well before, Liv, because I agree the vampire, like, it wouldn't have worked the same way if it was a maybe an alien and a werewolf that were fighting for her affections. But yeah, I think that was the problem, is that everyone thought, oh, it's because it's a vampire and that's the reason, and that's why all those ones, like those really lots of really very forgettable bad vampire books came after it, because it wasn't just that it was a vampire, it's what she managed to do with the mythology of the vampire. So yeah, I just think that, you know, as with a lot of publishing trends, you know, you get this one thing that works and everyone goes, oh, it's worked because of, and they haven't understood that the best way to make a hit is to make something unique and not just to try and repeat something else. Although, ironically, that's exactly what Stephanie Meyer has done here with her very crazy phenomenon of Midnight Sun.
But the funny thing is, it did go on to spawn 50 Shades of Grey, and that phenomenon repeated itself, but this time with like S&M, BDSM, and people thought, oh, it's because it's a BDSM novel, and then we got a bunch of, I guess, bad like erotica.
We got 50 Shades of Grey, and it is because of Stephanie Meyer. It's weird to remember that sometimes, that these two equally huge phenomenon came like coexist. They're like, well, one is the root of the other, and like, isn't it weird that you could? I mean, I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but like when you think about the uber big worldwide phenomenon publishing spikes, there's 50 Shades of Grey, and there's Twilight, and there's Harry Potter, and like what else? So like
the dystopian
Hunger Games,
definitely one that would
So like if we're going to identify those as the four of the last like 30 years or whatever, then it's weird that two of them, or I guess if you view 50 Shades as an extension of Twilight, are romance. Like, and I remember, you know, so many people saying when 50 Shades of Grey got published, everyone was like, the reaction was like, oh, nothing like this has been written. Whereas in fact, there's an entire genre of books that are like that have been going for years. It's a huge, the romance genre is like massive, and it's just that it's not generally mainstream, and a lot of people just aren't aware that these books are available.
Well, I guess it depends on like your literary classification. Sorry, that word completely escaped me. Like, I can't picture something like a really serious literary book written by a man being like a huge runaway phenomenon in the same way. Like, it's interesting to look at how all those kind of 4 books in series were written by women, were hugely commercial, and the way they were marketed and packaged up and whatnot. Like, it's interesting. Like, people saw dollar signs here, whereas it's not so much about the craft. Despite the fact that, like, I think they are all like entertaining enough in their own way and also interesting. 50 Shades less so. I really don't like that book.
I wonder sometimes how Stephanie Meyer feels about 50 Shades.
She is not happy. Weird. She was not happy.
Really? That doesn't surprise me. It must be bizarre to work so hard on this series and like watch it be so successful, and then have someone's fan fiction version of it have similar success. Yeah, like it would be bizarre.
But it's weird because I don't actually associate 50 Shades with Twilight at all, because I just think the characters are completely different. It's just that whole I can't be with this person and forbidden yearning and longing that I think is the similarity.
I've only ever seen the trailers to those movies, so I really have not much. I just know there is Dakota Johnson and that guy. and
then that guy.
He doesn't smile.
Hey, do you guys?
That's what I know.
Do you guys remember hearing? This is some Twilight trivia, I guess, but because I've been like reading so much about Midnight Sun, because I'm like seeing the sales come through and just like finding this whole thing such an interesting moment in publishing history, and been reading reviews and like what comes next and everything. Like, I've just been consuming content about Midnight Sun and Twilight in general. And I came across this thing which I was never aware of. But did you know that originally Stephanie Meyer wrote the series as a duology, and the first book was Twilight and the second book was called Forever Dawn, and it's written, and she gave it to her sister. And then, so it's like it exists. A full book called Forever Dawn exists that completes the story. And then, obviously, when after Twilight was published and they wanted to turn it into a series, she had to scrap Forever Dawn and spin it out into a longer series. But this, if you Google this, you can read about this Forever Dawn, which is an alternative version in which there's no love triangle with Jacob ever. And things, so it's basically the broad events of Breaking Dawn still happen, but without any kind of love triangle with Jacob. He's just a character. I believe he's just a character who is there to kind of serve as the person who tips Bella off about the vampires, like he does in the first book.
Oh yeah.
And then I don't know, he's around in the second book, but he's not the same. He's not like the second love interest anymore. And
it makes sense with the way that Edward feels about Jacob in Midnight Sun. You don't get any kind of animosity feeling that you get later at all.
Because he's just a kid, right? He's just this kid who's around in the first book. There's no hint until book 2.
One thing at the very end. Sorry, I lied. One thing at the very end when they're at the prom, and he goes, "Oh, he got tall," or says in his mind, about Jacob. Like,
suddenly he's a bit more of a threat.
But that's the same thing where Jacob's like, "Oh, that weird smell." It's like, because they don't really understand, because he doesn't know he's a werewolf yet. So you could read it more like that if you wanted, rather than that. That would be really, really interesting if the book, I wonder if a lot of the people that are really against the Twilight saga morph probably for, as you said, those books in the middle that kind of make Bella feel almost like if you don't have a boyfriend, you don't have a life, and you want to do dangerous things to make him come back, kind of thing. That didn't even happen, and you kind of moved on to like the story, because that feels more like how we're seeing the YA now, right? We're seeing so many more duologies, rather than necessarily like books that go on for that are 4 or 5 or 6 books long, kind of in that kind of space. So you get that kind of impactful storytelling really fast, but still with enough space to build that kind of real love of a character.
It's an interesting what if.
Yeah.
I would genuinely really love to read Forever Dawn, because I feel like if I could, not that there isn't things that are fun in those middle books, like the series as a whole is fun. I think I just, if I were to have continued liking the series as much as I did with book 1 through all the books, it would require cutting out the love triangle and the way that love triangle is resolved, which means which basically sounds like Forever Dawn. So it sounds like the original conception for this series is kind of more designed to please Sarah.
And isn't that what it's all about?
Yeah, really, I'm sure that was foremost in Stephenie Meyer's thoughts.
Yeah, but it is interesting to think about what going back to the thing we're talking about, something about what effect Midnight Sun may or may not have on the YA publishing. I feel to me that it will kind of sort of send the editors off and the commissioning agents or whatever they're called off to try and find some other phenomenon from the recent or more distant past that they can try and
get new books out of,
new spin on or something. But I think that's like at that one point of the publishing. But I think that I'm hoping that the YA publishing, since back in when it was really like YA was not as as broad as it is now. I really hope that doesn't go away. That we keep trying to come up with and get more and more stories of they can be romances, they can be adventure stories, they can be anything, crime novels, but more and more broad experiences and diversity of characters. And I think that's really great now that people didn't have that 15 years ago, and now you can
it's a totally different landscape now.
So many different kinds of books to hopefully represent all the lots of different kinds of people that are around. Because the one thing that was very a little bit jarring to me when I was reading the whole book was a number of times Edward refers to Bella's pale skin, and I was just like, oh, it's really strange to read that now because it's just not something that you would generally read in, in a way.
It's kind of
any
it's
genre.
a very white book. Like half the characters are literally like repeatedly referred to as being super pale and uber white.
And any characters that aren't like Jacob and the forgive me if I'm saying it wrong, the Quileute tribe, who actually aren't very happy about their depiction of.
I didn't even realize.
No, I wouldn't imagine they would be.
Yeah.
I felt really bad that I had no idea. I just thought they'd made
there is actually a donation page you can go to kind of like if you feel bad about you like having like participated in this craze without realizing like just how much like damage that they have been done because people like have apparently gone to their sacred sites and they like and treat them as tourists.
I had no idea that this was a thing. This was terrible. So that's an interesting. That would never Twilight as it is would never be published now with all of that in there. I don't think so. Like they would have for sure caught that in a sensitivity read and been like, you can't do this. You can't just co-opt an existing culture and turn them into werewolves to suit your story.
It's a bit uncomfortable when you think about it. A bit. It's like quite uncomfortable. But I have seen that pop up a couple of times in discussions of Midnight Sun, and it's all part of the whole, Twilight Renaissance. Like, oh, we're talking about this again. Cool. Let's talk about the things that don't work about it and things that were controversial or like, even on occasion harmful.
Yeah.
So like,
but that's why that's why I'm just so I've been really it's been really interesting to see how with all the YA trends that come and go and how they move, but how like the one thing that is like definitely broadening out is the different representations of people through own voice stories, so that hopefully everyone's experience, because that's what you want, right? If you're reading stories about about young adults, you want to be able to read about different the ways different people experience the world.
Definitely.
If you want to read about a vampire, you want to read about a werewolf, you want to read about someone from a different culture than you it's all things about things you don't know about. And even this year I've read some books where I was like, I was like, oh, but wow, this is something I never would have had a book when I was a teenager reading Sweet Valley High or Blonde Twins, that would have had like an Indian girl as a main character, but also still be a love story. That any of that kind of stuff just would never have happened. So it's really great having this phenomenon, but it's also great to recognize that this phenomenon still is like it's pop culture more than it is just what it's transcended reading books.
Definitely.
Like, reading a book is one thing, and then this is like a pop culture phenomenon that's like BTS, that same sort of it's the same sort of thing. It goes way past just what it is.
Yeah. And now that she's announced these plans for 2 more books, I'm really interested to see how, because we don't see it in Midnight Sun. Midnight Sun is a retelling of a story that's already set in stone. So there's only so much she can do.
And it's literally there is literally every single thing that was in the first book, and the conversations are in this book, just sometimes a little bit extra.
So it doesn't really give the author much room to update things, or to like write something that is Twilight, but more Twilight for now, because it's a retelling of something that's already done.
Yeah.
But if she writes something new, like if she's got 2 books in the works, we're going to see what she does to bring Twilight into this decade. And I'd be really interested.
They're not going to be retellings again, because
someone
from the New York Times asked her, and she said, no, not at all. This is it for Edward. I wouldn't want to do that, especially given that New Moon would be just a nightmare of depression and emptiness. So
yes, that was a good quote.
Yeah, no one wants
that article too.
I don't think anyone wants that. I would not want to read through the rest of this series from a different point of view. I think it's really cool to have the first one, but that's all we need. I want her now to expand it. I want her to take the series somewhere new, and I think that would be really exciting, not just for my sales as the kids and my category manager, But for
Well, Sarah, do you plan on having this job for another 40 years? Because you don't know how long it might take her to write the next book. She's going
Yeah, I
very
don't
slowly,
think these
she
are
said
coming
in
anytime
that
soon.
article.
oh yeah, one
Okay, I
because
don't think we've
she's
seen
not really a
2021.
one book a year person, right? This one took
No.
5 years.
No. Also, this is nothing to do with, it's to do with Stephanie Meyer, but not to do with the Twilight series. But am I the only person in the world that really loves The Host? Like, I really loved that book. Like,
Oh, I
Apparently
love
that's
The
what she
Host.
wants. Apparently, that's what she wants to be remembered for. The Guardian interviewed her, and she's like, "I'd love to be remembered
Oh,
for
really?
The Host, but it's probably going to be Twilight."
Oh, yes. Well, it's definitely going to
Which
be
is
Twilight.
interesting.
But
Yeah.
I think The
really,
Host is great.
I really liked that book. I thought it was a really interesting concept, and
Yeah, look, that
I
is
even
one of
liked
the
the movie.
only
It also got panned.
that is one of the only
But I
love
just,
triangles that I really genuinely enjoyed because it was such an interesting a love triangle with only 2 bodies involved.
Yes.
That's something new.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of thoughts about Twilight that we've put out there into the universe.
It is. It's an
I'm
exciting.
happy that I've read it. It is exciting, and I'm glad that I've read Midnight Sun and can now pass it on to my older sister, who has been like eagerly messaging me every single day. Have you finished yet? Have you finished yet? Can I have it?
That's so cute.
Caitlin, if you're listening, Midnight Sun is all yours.
I think
fun.
I might not be finished for a while because I'm going quite slowly. But
you're savouring it. You're savouring it. It's definitely
I'm
a
just
better way
reading
to
it
go than
at the same slow pace that it's like it's not a fast moving story, right? So you're not
It's a
propelled through
meandering
it.
story.
Yeah, you can just live in it
and you
for a
know
while
what happens
and take a
in it.
break.
Yeah.
So, final thoughts. Worth reading if you're a Twilight fan.
Oh, 100%.
Oh yeah.
If you're a Twilight
yeah.
fan, you will absolutely love this book. And no, absolutely.
And the sales support it. The Twilight fans are here. They're buying them.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so I think we'd better wrap it up.
And even if you're a Twilight, still good.
Yeah. All right, so let's wrap it up there. We've had a lot to say on this very, I wouldn't say divisive, but like it's contentious, this book. It's been fun chatting about it. I've really enjoyed this, actually. Gotten to take a trip down memory lane. So thanks so much for joining me, Sarah and Shanu. And if you're listening along at home, you can order your copy of Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer from Booktopia or your local indie bookstore. Enjoy the read, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Booktopia podcast channel. Don't forget, you can subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes for free and get access to hundreds of author discussions, book analysis pieces, and more. Or, if your eyes need a workout, head to Booktopia TV on YouTube. Don't forget, for all books featured in this podcast, and for access to a whole bunch of other fun content on our blog, head to Booktopia, Australia's local bookstore, at booktopia.com.au.